Hello there! I hope you're doing great. Today, I'm taking you on another chilling adventure. When you're ready, buckle up and let's go. Story number 1, The House on Ridgeway Lane. It was a cold October evening when Emily received the email. The subject line was unassuming, an opportunity for you. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the mouse. Spam? Maybe. But curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked. The email contained a single line of text. Do you want to escape your life? Beneath it was a link. Emily lived a monotonous existence, working long hours as an administrative assistant in a company where no one remembered her name. Her small apartment was dimly lit, cluttered, and suffocating. There were nights she stared at the ceiling, thinking how easily she could disappear without anyone noticing. The email felt like a dare. She clicked the link. A website loaded, its background black and text white. The words at the top read, "The House on Ridgeway Lane. Your new life awaits." There were no pictures, no testimonials, just an address and a simple form asking for her name. Against her better judgment, Emily typed her name, hit submit, and closed her laptop. The next day, a package arrived. A key, shiny and brass, lay nestled in black velvet. No note accompanied it. Tucked beneath the key was a handwritten address, 112 Ridgeway Lane. "Is this a prank?" Emily murmured, turning the key over in her hand. But the address wasn't far. Her curiosity festered and grew throughout the day. By nightfall, she was driving through winding roads, past barren trees silhouetted by the moon, toward Ridgeway Lane. When she found the house, it stood alone, shrouded in shadows. The structure was grand but aged, with peeling paint and windows that reflected the moonlight like unblinking eyes. And the key fit perfectly in the lock. Inside, the air was stale, and the house creaked as if it were stretching its long-abandoned bones. Emily flicked a switch, and a chandelier blinked to life, casting a golden glow on the ornate but decayed decor. A grand staircase spiraled upward, and hallways stretched into darkness on either side. She wandered, her footsteps echoing. Despite its eerie aura, the house felt familiar, as if she had been there before. In one room, a fireplace crackled to life without her touch. On the mantel stood a single framed photo of a smiling woman. Emily stepped closer, squinting. The woman was her, or someone who looked eerily like her. She stumbled back, knocking the photo to the floor. Glass shattered, but the sound didn't seem to echo. It was absorbed, swallowed by the silence. Her breathing quickened. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She explored further, drawn to the master bedroom. The bed was neatly made, its thick comforter inviting. On the nightstand sat an old rotary phone. The moment she touched the bedspread, the phone rang. Her heart seized. She hesitated before picking up. "Hello? Do you like it?" a deep voice asked. "Who is this?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "You wanted to escape," the voice said, almost taunting. "And now you have." The line went dead. The days blurred together. Something about the house was disorienting. No clocks ticked, and the sunlight filtering through the windows seemed stagnant, neither rising nor setting. Emily found herself sleeping at odd intervals, eating food she didn't remember bringing with her, and hearing faint whispers that stopped whenever she tried to locate their source. And on the fourth day, or what she thought was the fourth, Emily discovered a diary in a locked drawer. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in looping, elegant handwriting. Day 1. The house welcomed me with open arms. I feel free for the first time in my life. The entries mirrored her own experience. Each page described the strange familiarity of the house, the disconnection from time, and the whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls. Day 7. I found a photograph of myself on the mantel. But it isn't me. It can't be me. Is it the house's way of keeping me here? The last entry read, Day 14. The house doesn't let you leave. Not truly. I've tried. The door is there, but it leads back inside. I think I understand now. The house doesn't just welcome you, it consumes you. Emily slammed the diary shut. Her pulse raced as she ran to the front door. She threw it open and stepped outside, expecting the crisp night air to hit her skin. Instead, she was back in the foyer. "No," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She tried again, running faster this time, pushing harder. Each time she found herself back inside. The house was alive. The whispers grew louder as the days passed, turning into voices, mocking, pleading, screaming. They spoke of regret, of lives abandoned, of the trap Emily had willingly stepped into. One night, unable to sleep, Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Her face looked hollow, her eyes sunken. She turned on the faucet to splash water on her face. When she looked up again, her reflection wasn't hers. The woman in the mirror smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach her eyes. "Who are you?" Emily choked out, her voice barely audible. "I'm you," the reflection replied, its voice distorted and echoing. "The new you." The glass cracked, a spiderweb of fractures radiating outward. Emily stumbled back, but the reflection didn't mimic her movement. Instead, it leaned closer to the glass, pressing its hands against the mirror as if trying to push through. Emily woke up the next morning on the bed, fully clothed, with no memory of how she got there. Her limbs were heavy, her mind foggy. The diary lay open beside her, though she didn't recall retrieving it. The most recent entry wasn't in the elegant script of the previous author. It was in her handwriting. Day 21. The house loves me. It's part of me now. I understand why it chose me. Emily slammed the diary shut. Her hands trembled as she gathered her belongings, what little she had brought, and made her way to the door. It was another futile attempt, but she had to try. As she approached, the door opened on its own. For the first time, sunlight poured in. The sight of the road beyond filled her with hope. She stepped outside, half expecting to be pulled back. But she wasn't. She was free. Emily drove home, the weight lifting from her chest with every mile she put between herself and Ridgeway Lane. When she reached her apartment, it was exactly as she'd left it, dim, cluttered, and suffocating. But it was hers. She collapsed onto the couch, laughing and crying in equal measure. For a few days, life returned to normal. Work was dull but familiar. Nights were restless but real. Emily told herself it had all been a bizarre dream, a figment of her overactive imagination. But the whispers started again. At first they were faint, just a word or two, barely audible. Then they grew louder, more insistent. Emily began seeing shadows move in her peripheral vision, reflections that didn't align with her movements. One night, she woke up to find herself standing in her living room, holding the key to Ridgeway Lane. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She hadn't left the house. Not truly. It had led her believe she had escaped, but she was still trapped within its walls, its influence bleeding into her perception of reality. As the whispers grew deafening, Emily turned toward the mirror above her fireplace. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't her. The smiling woman was there again. "Welcome home," the reflection said, grinning wider than before. The last thing Emily saw was her reflection reaching out, its hand breaking through the glass. Story number 2. Berlin Excursion. The train pulled into Berlin Hauptbahnhof under a pall of low, heavy clouds. The trip from London had been spontaneous, one of those last-minute ideas over beers in a Shoreditch pub. Liam had insisted on it. "Berlin's got everything," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with that confident grin that always got them to agree. Clubs, weird art galleries, and more urban legends than you could cram into a Netflix series. Maya had hesitated, her fingers brushing her wine glass. "Urban legends?" "You know," Liam said with a wave of his hand, "all those creepy stories about secret tunnels, cursed buildings, haunted forests. Stuff to make you think twice. I'm telling you, it's the perfect weekend adventure." Perfect. That was the word they'd use later to laugh at how wrong Liam had been. The group consisted of Liam, Maya, Nate, and Emma, friends since university. Their dynamics were as predictable as they were comfortable. Liam, the instigator, Maya, the skeptic, Nate, the techie with his ever-present camera, and Emma, the quiet observer who never said much but missed nothing. The first day in Berlin was uneventful. They walked the cobbled streets, posed in front of graffiti-covered walls, and laughed over steins of beer. But it was on the second night, deep in the throbbing neon of a nightclub, that the atmosphere shifted. A stranger approached their table. His eyes were shadowed, his smile too wide. He spoke in halting English with a voice like sandpaper. "You want real Berlin? Not tourist Berlin?" Liam, already tipsy, grinned back. "Hell yeah, we do!" The stranger produced a crumpled card and slid it across the table. "This address. Midnight. You will find what you are looking for." Maya frowned. "What do you mean, what we're looking for?" The man's smile didn't falter. "Everyone who goes there finds something." The address led them to a derelict industrial district where shadows loomed unnaturally long under sparse, flickering streetlights. The streets were empty except for the occasional stray sound, a distant metallic clang, the scrape of something unseen against concrete. Even the air felt heavier here, laden with a metallic tang that clung to their nostrils. "Tell me this doesn't look like a murder scene," Maya whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. Liam forced a grin, though it was thinner now. "It's Berlin. Edgy, right?" The building they sought stood at the end of the street, a squat, windowless structure smeared with graffiti, the symbols too jagged and alien to decipher. A single red door stood under a dying bulb, its light twitching erratically. "This is it," Liam said, his voice a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "This is insane," Maya hissed, clutching Emma's arm. "We should leave." But Nate, ever the tech enthusiast, was already pulling out his camera. "Let's at least document it. For the aesthetic," he said with a nervous chuckle. Liam pushed open the door without hesitation, and the sound that greeted them was a low, pulsing bass line. It felt more like a heartbeat than music, reverberating in their bones. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with smoke that smelled faintly of burning hair. The room stretched farther than seemed possible from the outside, its high ceiling lost in darkness. People danced in erratic, jerky motions under dim red lights. Their faces were partially obscured, their features caught in flashes that seemed slightly wrong. Too angular, too sharp. The walls were lined with mirrors, huge, warped panels that bent and twisted their reflections. Liam was the first to notice. "Creepy, huh?" he said, staring at his distorted face. His grin stretched unnaturally wide in the warped glass. "Like some funhouse horror show." "I don't like this," Maya said, pulling her coat tighter around herself. She glanced at her reflection and quickly looked away. "It feels off." "Let's just get a few shots and go," Nate said, raising his camera. But the moment he clicked the shutter, the music stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No murmur of conversation, no shuffling of feet. The dancers froze mid-motion, their heads snapping toward the group in eerie unison. "Oh, hell no," Maya whispered, her voice shaking. It wasn't the dancers that drew their attention. It was the mirrors. The reflections didn't stop moving. Liam's distorted grin in the mirror widened until it split his face like a raw wound. Nate's mirrored double raised its hand and waved, though Nate himself hadn't moved. Maya stared in horror as her reflection leaned closer to the glass, its face pale and glistening as if wet. "What the—" Emma's voice broke off as her own reflection pressed a hand against the inside of the glass. The pane rippled like water, and a soft, hollow tapping began to echo in the room. The tapping grew louder, and then the reflections stepped out. They emerged not as people but as grotesque parodies. Wrong angles, too tall limbs, and faces that bore just enough of a resemblance to make their differences unbearable. "Run," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The group turned toward the red door, but it was gone. The mirrors now lined every wall, each surface filled with their grinning doubles. The reflections moved closer, their bare feet dragging across the floor with a sickening wet sound. "They're not real! They're not real!" Nate screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the pounding of the bass line, which had resumed without warning. The reflections began to whisper. The words were incomprehensible at first, a guttural symphony of hisses and clicks. But soon, they resolved into words that struck the group like physical blows. Liar, coward, traitor, thief. Each accusation came with a new horror in the mirrors. Liam's reflection showed him laughing while holding a bloodied object. Maya's double wept as it dragged a limp body across the floor. Nate's grinned as he reached for a trembling, unseen figure. Emma's whispered something inaudible, her teeth bared in a smile that stretched far too wide. "Move!" Nate yelled, yanking Maya toward the center of the room. But no matter where they turned, the mirrors closed in, their surfaces no longer reflecting but showing something worse, visions of a place that wasn't the room they were in. It was a labyrinth of endless corridors, each darker and more suffocating than the last, and in every pane of glass the reflections were waiting, their faces frozen in twisted glee. "Stay together," Nate said, his voice shaking. But the group was already being pulled apart. The whispers grew louder, now screaming accusations and promises of release. "You can't hide," the voices hissed. "We see you. We are you." One by one, the group was claimed. Emma was the last to go, her reflection stepping through the glass and wrapping its hands around her throat. Her final, gasping scream was drowned out by the return of the bass line, louder and more triumphant than ever. Emma's scream cut off as her reflection dragged her into the glass. The surface rippled violently, like a disturbed pool, and then stilled. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the mirrors themselves, as if they were alive and breathing. The room was empty now, or at least it seemed to be. Inside the mirrors, however, the nightmare continued. Emma hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. The floor beneath her was cold and smooth like polished obsidian, and it stretched endlessly in all directions. Above her there was no ceiling, just a sky of swirling black and crimson streaks pulsing as though alive. "Liam? Nate? Maya?" she croaked, her voice echoing strangely, as if the space itself was twisting her words. No answer. She pushed herself to her feet, her eyes scanning the endless horizon of dark mirrors. In every direction, towering glass panes loomed, their surfaces reflecting not the world around her but something else. Scenes of pain, torment, and shadows that slithered just out of sight. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. A faint sound answered, distant but growing louder, the faint scrape of footsteps. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. It was Liam, or at least it looked like him. He was walking toward her, but his movements were stiff, unnatural. His head lolled to one side as though his neck couldn't support it, and his mouth twisted in an unsettling grin. "Emma," he said, his voice high and lilting, like a child mocking her. "Why did you let this happen?" "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, backing away. He tilted his head further, the grin splitting his face wider. "You brought us here, didn't you? You always follow me, but this time, you wanted to see what would happen." "I didn't you?" His voice dropped to a guttural growl, his face flickering like a distorted video. Emma turned and ran. The ground beneath her seemed to shift with every step, her feet slipping on the glassy surface. The mirrors around her reflected her panic, her wide, terrified eyes staring back at her from 100 angles, each more distorted than the last. In some, she wasn't running. In some, she was screaming. In others, she was standing still, her face pale and lifeless. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air like a storm. "Run, Emma! Hide, Emma! There's nowhere to go, Emma!" She stumbled to a halt as a new figure stepped out from a nearby mirror. It was Maya, but her skin was a sickly gray, and her eyes were hollow sockets that oozed black liquid. "You left me," Maya said, her voice hollow and echoing. "No, You always left me," Maya hissed, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide as she screamed the words. Emma turned again, but everywhere she ran, more figures emerged from the mirrors, twisted, warped versions of her friends, their voices accusing, their bodies moving in impossible ways. She tripped and fell, landing hard on her knees. "Stop," she sobbed. "Please stop!" But the figures didn't stop. They closed in, their voices blending into a deafening cacophony. Nate was lost in a different part of the mirror world. His camera was still clutched in his hands, but when he tried to take a picture, the device wouldn't respond. Every screen, every lens, reflected only his own face, twisted and afraid. He heard Liam's voice first. "Nate, over here!" Relief surged through him as he spotted Liam standing by a tall, fractured mirror. But when Nate approached, he froze. Liam's reflection didn't match his movements. While the real Liam stood still, the reflection was grinning, blood dripping from its teeth. "Nate," the reflection whispered, leaning close to the glass. "Don't you want to know what happened to me?" Nate stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Come closer," the reflection cooed. Its hand pressed against the glass, and Nate watched in horror as the pane began to crack. The fractures spread rapidly, spiderwebbing across the surface until the mirror exploded outward in a shower of glass. The reflection stepped out. It wasn't Liam anymore. Its skin was too pale, its eyes too large and filled with black. It moved with a jerky insect-like gait, its joints popping grotesquely as it crawled toward him. "Where's your camera now, Nate?" it hissed. Hours, or was it days, later, Emma and Nate collided in a narrow corridor of mirrors. Both were bruised and trembling, their clothes torn and bloodied. "Nate!" Emma gasped, throwing her arms around him. "We have to get out of here," Nate said, his voice hoarse. "This place, it's alive. It's feeding on us." "I've seen them," Emma whispered. "Liam, Maya, they're not real anymore. They've turned into things." Nate nodded grimly. "I think it's showing us our guilt, our regrets. It's trying to break us." "How do we fight it?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. Before Nate could answer, the mirrors around them rippled. The reflections of Liam and Maya appeared again, their distorted faces filled with malice. "You can't fight the truth," Maya's reflection hissed. "Give in," Liam's reflection added. "This place is where you belong. It's who you are." The walls began to close in, the mirrors bending toward them as if to swallow them whole. "Nate!" Emma screamed. But Nate wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on a shard of broken mirror on the ground. "Emma," he said, his voice steady for the first time. "We smashed the mirrors." Nate grabbed the shard of broken mirror, its edges sharp enough to draw blood from his trembling fingers. He turned to Emma, his eyes wild but resolute. "This place, it's nothing without the mirrors. They're the anchors. If we break them, maybe we can break out." The whispers grew louder, a symphony of mocking laughter and guttural growls. "You can't escape," Liam's reflection taunted, stepping closer. You're part of this now. Emma looked at the countless mirrors surrounding them, each one rippling with dark reflections of themselves and their friends. Her own image twisted grotesquely, its eyes black pits that seemed to pull her in. She fought the magnetic pull and nodded. Do it, she whispered. Nate raised the shard and slammed it into the nearest mirror. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, echoing endlessly in the labyrinth. The mirror exploded into 1,000 jagged fragments, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then the shards began to melt, oozing like black tar, and the ground trembled violently. It's working! Nate shouted. Emma grabbed a loose piece of mirror from the ground and began smashing the others. One by one, they shattered, each explosion sending ripples of darkness across the endless horizon. The labyrinth groaned, the air itself seeming to collapse inward. But the reflections didn't take it lightly. They screamed, high-pitched, inhuman wails that pierced through Emma and Nate's ears. Liam's reflection lunged at Nate, claws sprouting from its hands, but Nate dodged and drove the shard into its chest. The reflection let out a choked scream and dissolved into black smoke. Keep going, Emma yelled, tears streaming down her face. The mirrors shattered faster now, as if the labyrinth itself was unraveling. The walls twisted and warped, the once solid ground breaking apart into floating shards of obsidian. The crimson sky above began to bleed into darkness, and the reflections, one by one, began to disappear. Emma and Nate smashed the final mirrors, standing back to back as the world crumbled around them. What now? Emma asked, panic rising in her voice. Nate looked around desperately, then spotted it. A single glowing light in the distance, faint and flickering like a dying star. There! He shouted, grabbing Emma's hand. They ran, the ground shattering beneath their feet, the labyrinth folding in on itself. The light grew brighter as they approached, and Emma realized it was a doorway, small, unassuming, but blindingly white against the black void. This has to be it, Nate cried. The reflections' voices returned, screaming in unison. You can't leave! Just as the reflections lunged for them, Emma and Nate dove through the door, the blinding light swallowing them whole. Emma woke up on the cold concrete of the Berlin street, gasping for air. The red door loomed behind her, now boarded shut and covered in graffiti that hadn't been there before. Nate? She whispered, sitting up. He lay a few feet away, unconscious but breathing. She crawled over to him and shook his shoulder until his eyes fluttered open. We made it, he murmured, his voice hoarse. Emma helped him sit up, both of them staring at the now silent building. The hum of the city returned, cars in the distance, the faint chatter of people. It was as if nothing had happened. But something was wrong. Where's Liam? Emma asked, her voice trembling. And Maya, Nate added, glancing around. They searched the street, calling their friends' names, but the area was deserted. Panic rose in Emma's chest. They were with us. She stopped when Nate's face went pale. He pointed to the building's boarded-up windows. Their reflections were there, faint but unmistakable. Liam and Maya, staring back at them from the other side of the glass. Their faces were blank, their mouths slightly open as if screaming, but no sound came through. Emma stumbled back, shaking her head. No, that's not... Before she could finish, the reflections moved. Liam and Maya raised their hands in unison, pressing them against the glass. Their mouths stretched into wide, grotesque grins. Emma turned to Nate, her heart pounding. Do you see that? But Nate wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a nearby puddle, where his own reflection stared back at him. It grinned. Emma and Nate were never the same after that night. They returned to London, but something had shifted. The air felt heavier around them, their memories fragmented, their days blending into nights in a haze. They never spoke of Berlin again. Weeks turned into months. Emma tried to move on, throwing herself into work and avoiding mirrors altogether. Even her reflection in passing windows made her uneasy. Nate, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn. He covered every reflective surface in his flat, muttering about something watching whenever Emma visited. One night, after ignoring her calls for days, Nate finally answered. Come over, he whispered, his voice trembling. I think it followed us. Emma arrived at Nate's flat to find the windows boarded up and the lights dim. The place reeked of stale air and fear. She called his name, but there was no response. She found him in the living room, sitting in front of his covered TV. His back was to her, his head tilted slightly to the side. Nate? She said softly. He didn't move. She circled around to face him and gasped. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with terror, and fixed on the dark screen of the TV. Though it was turned off, The faint outline of his reflection was visible in the black glass. "Emma," he croaked, without looking at her. "It's not me." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. He finally turned to her, his movements slow and jerky, as if his body resisted the motion. "It's still in the mirrors," he said, "watching, waiting. I think it wants you now." Emma froze, a chill creeping down her spine. "What are you?" The room plunged into darkness. Emma's breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone, its dim light barely illuminating the room. She turned toward Nate, but his chair was empty. "Nate!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the oppressive silence. A faint whisper came from behind her. She spun around, the phone's light catching the edge of the TV. The screen was no longer dark, it shimmered faintly, like water. In the glass she saw her reflection. It wasn't moving. Her reflected self stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Its lips twisted into a smile, slow and deliberate. "No," Emma whispered, backing away. "No, no." The reflection raised a hand, tapping on the inside of the screen. The sound echoed in the room, a hollow, rhythmic knock. Then it spoke, its voice identical to hers but layered with something deeper, darker. "You didn't escape," it said, the smile widening impossibly. Emma's phone flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. But the knocking continued. 2 weeks later, Emma's flat was found abandoned, her phone lying on the floor with the screen cracked. Neighbors reported strange noises coming from her unit, the sound of muffled knocking, laughter, and a woman's voice pleading for help. The investigation yielded no leads. The landlord replaced the broken mirror in her bathroom before renting the flat to someone new. But late at night, if you stare too long into the glass, you might see it. A faint reflection that doesn't quite match your movements, smiling just a little too wide. And if you listen closely, you might hear a faint, hollow knock from the other side. Story number 3, The Date. Toronto was a city of contrasts, especially in winter. By day, its streets bustled with life. By night, the fog swallowed it whole, leaving the world eerily quiet. Will adjusted the collar of his coat as he checked his phone again. "See you at 8. Don't be late. Lily." The message from Lily stared back at him, innocent yet foreboding. They'd been talking for weeks through a dating app. She wasn't like anyone else he'd matched with. There was something magnetic about her. Her photos showed a haunting beauty, piercing green eyes, dark hair that seemed to drink the light, and a smile that promised both pleasure and danger. Her profile was sparse. Sometimes the best things are hidden in shadows. Lily had chosen the meeting spot, a restaurant called La Voile Noire, the Black Veil. Will had never heard of it. It wasn't on Google Maps, and when he asked about it at work, his colleagues just shrugged. But now, as he stood outside its narrow black door, he was questioning everything. The sign above was barely legible, its letters flickering weakly in the mist. No sound came from within. He hesitated, debating whether to turn around and leave, when the door creaked open. And there she was, Lily. She was stunning, more than her pictures had hinted at. Her green eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, her black dress fitting her like a second skin. Her smile was sharp, as if she knew every secret Will had ever tried to bury. "You must be Will," she said, her voice smooth as velvet. "Yeah," he stammered, offering a hand. Instead of shaking it, she took his arm. Her touch was cold. "Come on," she said, leading him inside. The interior of La Voile Noire was otherworldly. Dim chandeliers cast flickering light that seemed to warp the room. Abstract paintings adorned the walls, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to shift when Will looked too long. The patrons were unsettlingly quiet, their pale faces turned toward Lily with expressions that bordered on reverence. "Nice place," Will said, trying to lighten the mood. Lily smiled faintly. "It has character." As they sat, Will couldn't help but notice the way the staff watched Lily, as though awaiting her command. When she waved her hand, a waiter appeared almost instantly, their gaze never quite meeting Will's. Lily ordered for both of them, her choices as cryptic as the menu descriptions: the harvest's last gift and the wine of forgotten days. "You come here often?" Will asked, his voice shaky. "More than you'd think," she replied, her smile unreadable. Conversation started easily enough, light, flirtatious, and playful. But as the meal progressed, Lily's questions grew stranger. "Do you ever wonder why you're alive, Will?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "Why you?" she said, leaning forward. "Out of all the people in this city, why are you the one who gets to wake up every day?" I don't know," he replied, laughing nervously. "Luck, I guess." Her smile widened, but her eyes darkened. "Luck is a funny thing. It has a way of running out. Will's unease grew with every passing moment. The room seemed colder now, and the faces of the other diners, if they were diners, seemed blurred, as though viewed through frosted glass. When the bill came, Will instinctively reached for his wallet, but Lily stopped him with a touch. "Don't worry," she said. "You've already paid." He didn't understand what she meant, but before he could ask, she rose from the table. "Let's take a walk." The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the city in its pale embrace. Lily led him down Queen Street, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step echoing unnaturally loud. They passed no one. It was as though the city had emptied itself for them. "You're quiet," she said, glancing back at him. "It's eerie out here," Will admitted. "Eerie?" she repeated, laughing softly. "You don't know the half of it." They reached the waterfront, where the world felt suspended in time. The lake stretched out before them, black and endless, reflecting none of the city's faint light. Lily led him to a derelict pier, its boards rotting and slick with ice. She stopped at the edge, staring out over the water. Will hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "This place feels familiar, doesn't it?" Lily asked, her voice softer now. "No," Will said quickly. "I've never been here before." "Yes, you have," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes were sharper now, gleaming like emerald blades. "You just don't remember. Yet." A low, mournful sound rose from the water, a wail that sent chills racing down Will's spine. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily tilted her head, listening. "Them," she said simply. "Them who?" Before she could answer, the fog began to shift, forming shapes, twisted faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their expressions frozen in anguish. Will stumbled back. "What the hell is this?" "The past," Lily said, her voice calm. "Your past." Fragments of memory began to surface in Will's mind, images he'd spent years suppressing. He was driving down Lakeshore Boulevard late at night. The rain pounded against his windshield, and he was drunk. There had been an argument, a voice shouting at him from the passenger seat. Headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, too close, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, and then the water, freezing, suffocating. A woman's voice screamed, and then silence. "No," Will whispered, clutching his head. "No. That wasn't me. That didn't happen." "It did," Lily said, stepping closer. "You killed them, Will. All of them. And then you ran. You left them there to drown while you saved yourself." The faces in the fog grew clearer now. Children, parents, lovers, all staring at him with eyes full of accusation. "I didn't mean to," Will cried, tears streaming down his face. "Doesn't matter," Lily said, her voice cold and sharp. "What matters is that you've been running ever since. And tonight, it ends." The water below began to churn violently, waves crashing against the pier. Pale, skeletal hands emerged from the depths, clawing their way toward him. "Help me," Will begged, turning to Lily. She smiled, her green eyes glowing with eerie light. "I already have," she said. "I brought you here, didn't I?" The hands reached him, their icy grip pulling him toward the edge. He screamed, struggling against their hold, but it was no use. As the hands dragged him into the water, he saw Lily's form begin to shift. Her black dress transformed into flowing, tattered robes, her face becoming pale and gaunt. She wasn't human, not anymore. "Who are you?" he gasped as the freezing water swallowed him whole. Her voice echoed in his mind as the darkness consumed him. "I am the debt collector." Will woke with a gasp, choking on air. He was lying in his bed, the sunlight streaming through the blinds. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But then his phone buzzed. "Looking forward to tonight. Don't be late. Lily." His heart stopped. Slowly, he turned his head to the nightstand. Sitting there was a photograph he didn't recognize. A car sinking into a dark lake, the faces of its passengers staring back at him. Beneath it was a note, scrawled in blood-red ink. "You can't run forever." Story number 4. Escape from the Past. Emma and Luca arrived in Rome at dawn, the city's cobblestone streets glistening under the rain. They had left their small town in northern Italy behind, hoping the eternal city would grant them the fresh start they so desperately craved. Rome was crowded, chaotic, and alive, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of their past. Their new apartment was nestled in a crumbling Baroque building, its windows overlooking an ancient piazza. The landlady, Signora Vanni, was kind but cryptic. As she handed over the keys, she muttered in Italian, "Beware of what follows you. Some things stick to the soul." Luca dismissed the comment as superstition, but Emma couldn't shake the unease. She felt the city watching her, Its ancient ruins, narrow alleyways, and shadowy corners seemed alive. It wasn't paranoia, she told herself. It was just the weight of the memories they'd fled. But then, the first strange thing happened. The mirror in the bathroom cracked without warning, as if some unseen force had struck it. Emma froze, staring at her reflection fragmented into dozens of distorted pieces. Luca brushed it off as old glass reacting to humidity. Yet that night, she dreamt of their old house and the thing they had left behind. Days passed, but the city didn't feel welcoming. Rome, with its eternal beauty, seemed to reject them. Emma swore she saw faces she recognized in the crowded streets, people from their past who couldn't possibly be there. A man with a scar across his jaw stared at her on the metro, smiling faintly before vanishing into the crowd. And a woman in a red coat seemed to follow her into the market, only to disappear when Emma turned. Luca started to grow distant, preoccupied with work. The arguments they thought they'd left behind resurfaced, and the shadows of mistrust began to creep in again. Late one night, while Emma was lying awake, she heard faint whispers coming from the corner of their bedroom. She froze, staring at the darkness, but there was no one there. The next morning, Emma found a single word scrawled in condensation on the bathroom mirror: remember. Desperate to escape their growing unease, Emma suggested they explore Rome's historical sites. Maybe immersing themselves in the city's culture would help them forget. They wandered through the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, but Emma felt a constant prickle on the back of her neck, as though someone were watching them. At the Pantheon, Luca disappeared into the crowd. Emma panicked, calling his name, but only an old man in a tattered coat responded. And he grasped her wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "It's not the city that haunts you. It's you who brought it here." Before she could reply, the man was gone. When she finally found Luca, he was pale and shaking. "Did you hear it?" he asked. "Hear what?" she demanded. But Luca wouldn't say. He only murmured, "It's here." The tension between them grew unbearable. Luca began drinking, spending late nights out, leaving Emma alone in the apartment. She started hearing noises, footsteps above them, even though their apartment was on the top floor, and soft, mocking laughter in the middle of the night. One evening, while cleaning out an old cupboard, Emma found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles in a language she didn't understand. Flipping to the last page, she saw a chilling phrase written in bold, jagged letters: "They always find you." That night, she confronted Luca. "You've been acting strange since we got here. But aren't you telling me?" He broke down, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't want to tell you because I thought I was going crazy. I've been seeing him." "Who?" Emma demanded. "The man from the lake," Luca whispered. "The man from the lake." Emma's blood ran cold. They had buried the truth about what happened that night. The fight, the drunken rage, the accident. They'd left the body in the icy waters, swearing never to speak of it again. No one had seen them, and they had fled the town the next day. But now, it seemed their secret had followed them. The whispers grew louder. Emma began seeing wet footprints leading from the door to their bedroom. Luca claimed he saw a figure standing at the foot of their bed, his clothes dripping water onto the floor. Emma pleaded with him to leave, but Luca refused. "We can't run from this, Emma. He'll always follow us." One stormy night, the whispers turned into screams. The apartment shook as though an earthquake were tearing through it. Emma and Luca huddled in the living room, paralyzed with fear. The lights flickered, and the room grew icy cold. A shadow emerged from the hallway, a tall figure, drenched and decayed, with empty sockets where his eyes should have been. "You thought you could escape," the figure rasped, water dripping from his rotting jaw. "But the past always catches up." Emma screamed as Luca tried to shield her. The figure lunged, but instead of attacking, it stopped and spoke again, this time with a voice that sounded painfully familiar. "Emma." She froze. The figure's voice was hers. Emma woke up in a hospital bed, her head pounding. Luca was gone. A doctor stood at her bedside, looking concerned. "Emma, do you know where you are?" he asked gently. "What happened?" she whispered. "You were found wandering near the Tiber River, muttering to yourself," the doctor said. "You've been here for weeks." Her memories flooded back like a broken dam. There was no Luca. He had died that night at the lake. She had killed him in a fit of rage and concocted a story to absolve herself of guilt. The man from the lake was Luca, trying to remind her of the truth. Everything she had experienced in Rome, the whispers, the shadows, the terror, had been her fractured mind trying to force her to confront what she had done. As the doctor left the room, Emma caught her reflection in the window. Luca's face stared back at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. The past wasn't following her. She was the past. Story number 5. The Shadows of Puerto Rico. Emma and Daniel had always dreamed of visiting Puerto Rico. The vibrant culture, lush rainforests, and turquoise waters seemed like the perfect escape from their hectic lives in New York City. When Emma stumbled upon a boutique resort on the island of Vieques, she knew it was the destination they had been searching for. The resort's website promised serene beaches, glowing bioluminescent bays, and a secluded ambiance that made it feel like a hidden paradise. Emma couldn't resist booking it immediately, imagining lazy days spent under the sun and romantic evenings by the water. The couple arrived under a radiant sun, greeted by a cheerful host named Carla, who handed them rum cocktails as soon as they stepped off the ferry. Carla, a petite woman with dark hair and an air of practiced hospitality, guided them to their cabana. The resort was a small cluster of charming bungalows nestled between lush mangroves and a pristine white sand beach. "You'll love it here," Carla said with a wide smile, though her eyes carried a flicker of something unreadable. "Just remember to stay indoors after dark. The mangroves can get confusing at night." Emma and Daniel exchanged puzzled looks but shrugged it off. They chalked it up to an eccentric local superstition. That evening, they dined on freshly grilled seafood under a canopy of stars. The air was warm, the ocean breeze carried the soothing sound of waves lapping against the shore, and the chirping of coqui frogs created a natural symphony. Emma smiled, feeling like they had stepped into a dream. "This night feels magical," she said softly, reaching for Daniel's hand. But the magic didn't last. The first odd occurrence came on their second night. They had signed up for a kayaking tour in Mosquito Bay, famous for its dazzling bioluminescence. The water glowed an otherworldly blue with each stroke of their paddles, leaving Emma and Daniel mesmerized. Their guide, an elderly man named Raoul, seemed tense as the sun began to set. "We must return before it's fully dark," he insisted, his voice tinged with unease. He paddled ahead of the group, his movements quick and deliberate. "The bay, it's not safe at night." Emma trailed her hand through the glowing water, fascinated by the glittering light that followed her touch. "It's so beautiful," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Why wouldn't it be safe?" Raoul didn't answer. His eyes darted nervously toward the mangroves that bordered the bay, their dark silhouettes casting long shadows over the water. As Emma continued to marvel at the phenomenon, the temperature of the water under her hand suddenly dropped. She gasped, yanking her hand back. For a split second, she thought she saw something beneath the surface. A pale face, eyeless and gaunt, stared up at her from the depths. She blinked, and it was gone. Shaking her head, she forced a laugh. "Just my imagination," she murmured, though her heart raced. Back on shore, Raoul hurriedly packed up the gear without meeting their eyes. "Stay away from the mangroves," he muttered. "And whatever you do, don't go near the old sugar mill." The next day, curiosity got the better of them. Despite Raoul's cryptic warning, Emma and Daniel decided to explore the island. They rented bicycles and rode along winding paths lined with dense greenery. The lush surroundings were breathtaking, and for a while, they forgot about the unsettling encounter from the night before. But the deeper they ventured, the quieter it became. The cheerful chirping of coqui frogs faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the rustling of leaves seemed subdued, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They stumbled upon the old sugar mill around midday. The crumbling structure was overgrown with vines, its once sturdy walls now weathered and cracked. It exuded an air of abandonment, a relic of a bygone era. Daniel, always the adventurous one, suggested they take a look inside. "Come on," he said with a grin. "How often do you get to explore something like this?" Emma hesitated. The mill's looming presence unsettled her, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. She followed Daniel inside, the air growing cooler as they stepped through the arched entrance. The walls bore strange, faded carvings, symbols and patterns that neither of them recognized. In the center of the room lay a massive pit, its edges lined with blackened stones. A faint smell of soot lingered, sharp and acrid. Emma's chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A faint whisper echoed back, "Leave." Daniel froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. Before Emma could respond, a sudden wind rushed through the mill, extinguishing the daylight that had streamed in through the broken roof. Shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them and coalescing into forms. They were humanoid but grotesquely distorted, their limbs too long and their faces void of features. Panic surged through them, and they fled, stumbling over debris as the shadows seemed to reach for them. The oppressive feeling followed them all the way back to the resort, and that night, Emma woke to find Daniel sitting by the window, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. He pointed toward the mangroves. "The shadows," he said hoarsely. "They're watching us." The following days were a blur of terror. No matter where they went, the shadows followed. During the day, Emma and Daniel would find faint footprints outside their cabana, even when they hadn't left it. At night, whispers echoed through the air, faint and unintelligible but filled with malice. The sense of being watched never left them. Desperate for answers, they sought out Raoul. After much pleading, the old man reluctantly revealed the truth. The sugar mill, he explained, was the site of a horrific tragedy during the colonial era. Enslaved workers who had attempted to escape were captured and thrown into the pit at the mill, where they were burned alive as a warning to others. Their spirits, Raoul said, had never moved on. They lingered in the shadows, restless and vengeful, bound to the island and to anyone who disturbed their cursed ground. "You saw them," Raoul said grimly. "Now they've seen you. They won't stop." On their final night, Emma and Daniel decided to flee. The resort no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a trap. They packed hurriedly, planning to catch the earliest ferry back to the mainland. As they loaded their luggage into their rental car, the engine sputtered and refused to start. Daniel cursed under his breath, trying again and again, but the car remained lifeless. Shadows loomed at the edge of the resort, growing closer with each passing moment. Emma's breath hitched as she saw their distorted forms creeping toward them. "We have to run," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They sprinted toward the beach, hoping to flag down a boat or find some means of escape. But the sand seemed endless, stretching on forever as the ocean receded further with every step. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of sinister voices. The shadows surrounded them, cutting off any path to safety. Emma screamed as Daniel was dragged into the darkness, his cries of terror swallowed by the void. She felt icy hands grip her arms and legs, pulling her down into the sand. The last thing she saw was the pale, eyeless face from the bay, staring at her with an expressionless gaze. The next morning, Carla greeted new guests with her usual cheerful smile. The resort seemed untouched, the beach pristine and inviting. When one of the newcomers asked about the vacant cabana by the mangroves, Carla hesitated for a moment before replying. "Oh, that one. It's not available right now," she said, her smile unwavering. Far out in the mangroves, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. "Stay." Thank you for coming on this adventure with me. If you made it this far, then try to guess the spooky riddle you'll find in the comments, and also leave a ghost emoji down below. If you enjoyed this journey, then you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and check out also other scary stories in this channel. Take care and see you in our next journey.